Hi guys and gals, today I'm going to teach you how to make this layered landscape pattern filled with lots of colors and bright colors and patterns. So the objectives here are to focus on the elements of art, line and color, and also the principle of pattern, which of course is repetition of shapes or lines or colors or textures. I'm hoping that you watched the videos first that I posted so that you have a pretty good understanding of those elements and principles before we begin. So the idea here too is that I want you all to understand when you're looking at a landscape what the foreground is, the middle ground, and the background. The foreground is going to be things in the picture or the painting or the artwork that are largest. They're at the bottom of the picture, they have the most detail, and they are the clearest. Things in the middle ground are just what they seem like. They are smaller than things in the foreground. They are therefore looking like they are a little bit further away. It's creating depth, and they have less details and less clarity than the foreground. The background is going to be at the top of your page. It is going to be what is furthest away from the viewer. It has sometimes the least amount of details. It is sometimes more faded as far as color goes. That doesn't apply to our painting here, but just to help you understand creating depth in a piece of artwork. So foreground, middle ground, and background. So to begin, you are going to need a piece of white paper. If you have just printer paper, that will work okay, but if you have sketchbook paper or painting paper, that will work much better for you. You're going to need some watercolors. Here's the kind that I have in the classroom. This was a gift from some students. You're going to need a pencil and a Sharpie. You'll need a paintbrush or two and a bucket with water for painting, and then you'll be ready to begin. Okay, let's get started. So to begin, you're going to need to turn your paper in landscape position, meaning that it is wider than it is tall. You have more space left to right than you do up and down. I'm going to start at the bottom of my page with the foreground. And for this landscape, we're going to create some very detailed and interesting flower shapes to fill the foreground of our paper. So I'm going to start by simply drawing some flowers. Okay, once I've drawn out the foreground, then I can start on the middle ground. I want to point out that in the foreground, I included several flowers. It takes up about the bottom third of my paper. So if I were to split my paper into thirds, 1, 2, 3, you can see that about the bottom third of my paper is taken up by my flowers that are my foreground. Also, this artwork has a lot to do with pattern. So what I want to see is if you create one shape or design inside one petal on your flowers, that you repeat that shape, and when we get to it, same color, creating patterns within your flowers. Plain flowers will not do for this project because I am looking for an understanding of creating pattern through repetition. So now I'm going to start on my middle ground, which is going to take up roughly the center third of my paper. And I'm going to create maybe some waves here with some hills. And of course, I hope you've realized that we are not drawing a realistic landscape for this project. Okay, and finally, I'm going to do the background in my top third or last third left in my paper. I think I am going to use something circular to help me trace my sun, and it could be in the center or it could be off center. I think I'm going to go a little off center. I'm only going to trace the part that is peeking up behind my hills. If you don't have a Sharpie, or if your parent does not want you to use a Sharpie, you can use a black colored pencil or a black crayon, but don't use a regular black marker because it will smudge when you add paint and make your colors look kind of muddy. When the Sharpie work is finished, it's always important to use an eraser to neaten up your drawing, because oftentimes there are quite a few pencil marks that are left behind, peeking out from behind your Sharpie. Oh, I got a couple little spots here. Now that my drawing's all clean, we are ready for paint. Okay, if you don't have paints at home, it's perfectly acceptable to color this in with markers or crayons or colored pencils. That would be just fine with me as well. But if you have paints, this is a great opportunity to use them. So I'm going to use my watercolors. You want to make sure you've got your paint palette out. Maybe a couple different size brushes would be helpful for some of those small spaces, and of course a bucket of water. So I encourage you to mix your own colors whenever you'd like to, using your knowledge of the color wheel, knowing what colors will mix nicely together to make a nice new color. And I also encourage you to consider color families or color schemes, because you know quite a lot of them at this point. So if you wanted to think about grouping together maybe warm colors and cool colors, for example, I made my entire sky warm colors. I made all of these hills shades of green. I made my water shapes here just cool colors, and I used a variety of colors for my flowers. Just because I did that doesn't mean you need to, and you absolutely don't need to stick to any sort of realistic color scheme. That's just food for thought, things to consider when you're making your own artwork. So tips for success when you're using watercolor: remember you want both lots of water and lots of paint on your brush. So I always like to start by getting colors that I know I'm going to use wet, so that the watercolor cakes can start to absorb some of that water and soften them. It will make it easier to use them when you get to that step. So notice I'm cleaning my brush between each. If your paints get really dirty, it's really easy to get them really wet with a clean wet brush, and then just use a tissue or a paper towel to wipe over it and it will clean it for you. I think I'm gonna start with the sun. I'm kind of feeling pink today, so I think I'm gonna go for a pink sun. Again, I wanna make sure that I have lots of paint and lots of water on my brush at all times, which means I'm going to return to my water cup and my paints very frequently. You also have the freedom to mix colors for this project. So if I wanted to mix in some red with my pink because they're next to each other on the color wheel and I know that they will make a nice new color, then I can do that. I shouldn't say that pink's on the color wheel, but pink is a tint of red. So it's related to red, so I know that they will mix nicely. When I feel happy with how that looks, I'm gonna move on to the next thing. When you're working with watercolors, it helps to let areas dry before painting areas immediately next to them, because sometimes otherwise the colors will bleed or blend into each other and cross your black outlines, which sometimes is nice, but in this case is not something we are looking for. So instead of continuing with the sun, I'm gonna move over here while I've got pink on my brush and do something else that I want pink. If you're having a hard time staying in the lines, that's usually a sign that you need a smaller brush to do the job that you're trying to do. So that's why it's nice to have a variety of brushes. If you're not painting because you don't have paints available, then that is an indicator that you need, if you're not able to stay on the lines, that's an indicator that you need to use a smaller marker tip, or you may need to sharpen your colored pencil to a finer tip. If you're having trouble staying in the lines, you might not have the right tool. So think about that if you encounter that problem. Okay, I've finished painting all of the large areas, and I think that rather than trying to fit my paintbrush into these tiny little spaces that are left over, I'm going to instead get out some markers here and fill out the in-between spaces with markers. Sometimes it's nice if you use more than one kind of art supplies to make a piece of artwork. It's called using multimedia. Media is plural for medium. An art medium is whatever material you are using to make your artwork. So if you use more than one medium, you say this is a multimedia project. So because I am using watercolor and marker, I've made this a multimedia project. Remember too, if you didn't have paints to begin with, you could have done this whole project with just marker, and that would be just fine. Colored pencils or crayons or pastels would be just fine too. Even several of those, or more than one, and you could call it a multimedia project like mine. Notice I'm only coloring half of my leaves with this shade of green. I'm going to find another color or a different shade of green for the other halves, just to reinforce the idea that I understand what a pattern is. When you're finished with your artwork, I want you to check and make sure that you have demonstrated an understanding of all the objectives I'm looking for in this lesson. The first one is to make sure that you have shown me that the foreground occurs at the bottom front of your picture. So that is where your flowers should be nice and large, lots of details to look at, lots of colors and patterns. The middle 1/3 of your paper, or middle third, should be the middle ground. So in this case, we included some water and waves and some hills that have a medium level of details and pattern. And then the background should be at the top third of your paper where your sun is rising or setting, and you could have decided to do your sky in a different way than I did mine. That would be fine too. So you're showing me that you understand pattern, color, line, and perspective in the sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. I hope you feel proud of your artwork, and I hope you had some fun while you were making this too.